Welcome to our presentation. Thanks for coming, everybody. Linda and I have been over to Israel and what we call Palestine many times over the past years. Linda will tell more about how she spent time there when she does her section. The last time we were there, we went into the occupied territories, as we always do, visited Palestinians, but we also spent time inside Israel, in Tel Aviv, visiting Israeli friends. Every time we go there, the situation is worse than it was before. We always think it can't possibly be worse than this. It always gets worse the next time. The last time we were there, we were visiting friends in Tel Aviv, Israeli friends. And they told us, for example, that there are armed guards in Burger Kings in Tel Aviv. They told us a story of a little girl and her family walking down the street in Tel Aviv, saw a paper lunch bag in the curb. Somebody had left a little paper bag just lying next to the curb. And then maybe half a block away down the street, there was a man with dark eyes, dark hair, dark skin. Could have been an Israeli Jew, as a matter of fact, but could have been an Israeli Palestinian. And just the fact of that person with dark skin out there and the fact of a deserted lunch bag was enough to call the police and the bomb squad, essentially. So that's the kind of fear that people are living under in Israel. Then, of course, we go into the occupied territories, visit our Palestinian friends in Ramallah and Nablus, in Bethlehem. They're afraid that they're going to be shot when they step out of their house by a high-powered rifle wielded by an Israeli soldier. They are afraid that if they send their children to school, if there is school, that child might be shot on the way home. They're afraid if they go to the store, when the stores are open, they might come home and their house has been knocked down. So there's fear on both sides. Everybody's living under this intense fear. And so our presentation is about the reasons for that violence and that fear that people are living under over there. It's not just about violence, but the sources of the situation today. So we're going to try to present as comprehensive a view as we can, and we're going to try to condense a lot of information into as short a time as we can as well. One of the main things that you need to know about the situation is that the State of Israel and the United States have for some time had a very important strategic friendship. And because of that strategic friendship, the information that we get in this country about what's happening over there tends to reflect the attitude and the concerns of Israel and its citizens much more than it tends to reflect the concerns of Palestinian citizens. So this tends to distort the situation. Because of this distortion, one could walk around in this country getting the impression that the whole conflict is about hatred and craziness, that it's a religious conflict, that it's an ancient ethnic conflict, that it's some sort of millennium-long Hatfield-McCoy-style feud, that there's really no good reason for it, but if they would just all calm down, that it would get better somehow. None of these are actually the case, and we're going to try to describe some of the actual causes of the conflict there. Because we tend to hear more of the Israeli viewpoint in this country, in our presentation we're going to emphasize those historical facts that have shaped Palestinian consciousness so that you can better understand that as much as possible. To do this, we have to do some history, and we rarely go anywhere without a map. So just to start out, don't worry if you can't read all the words on this map particularly. You won't be quizzed on that later. One thing to know, this little piece of geography that we're talking about, this dagger-shaped place that is mostly called Israel today, would easily fit in western Washington, between Vancouver, BC, and Portland, Oregon. Easily. The West Bank here, where we hear so much of the news from, this hatched area, easily fit between Everett and Olympia. Gaza Strip, this little hatched area here, greater Seattle, maybe Seattle to Tacoma at best. Very tiny piece of real estate. Now, can somebody tell me, you can just call out your answer to this, how much of what is now called Israel was once called Palestine? 100%, yes. And where can one find Palestine on the map of the world today? Nowhere, exactly. Palestine has disappeared. And we're going to talk about how and why that happened. Now, who are Palestinians? Palestinians are people who have lived in that region for some time. Today's Jews, at least some of them, claim descent from the ancient Habiru, Hebrews, the Israelites, from the Bible stories and so forth. The Habiru have lived in the region for at least 3,000 years, probably more. In that same way, today's Palestinians claim descent from the ancient Kenaanu, who show up in the Bible as the Canaanites. The Kenaanu were a broad collection of peoples who have lived in the region at least 4,000 years, probably longer. Archaeology breaks down on this issue. They can't effectively date things to the detail to tell us who was there first or actually how long either of those people were there. So for all intents and purposes, both Palestinians and Jews have lived in the region forever, for longer than we have recorded history, for longer than archaeology can count. Neither necessarily always as the dominant people in the region, but always, always there have been Canaanites / Palestinians, and always there have been Hebrews, Israelites, Jews in the region, forever. Predominantly living peacefully together, not perfectly by any means, but there was not the kind of history of conflict or persecution of Jews in this region as there was in Europe and in Russia. So this is not particularly an ancient struggle at all between Arabs and Jews. The current struggle has its roots in the 1800s with the birth of the movement that we call Zionism. Ever since about 2,000 years ago, when Romans attempted genocide against the Habiru, against the Jews who were living in what was then called Palestine, many Jews moved to Europe. There was a large population of Jews in Europe, and for about 2,000 years, Jews in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in Russia were subjected to consistent and regular persecution. Apartheid in the best of times, pogroms, purges, and Holocaust in the worst of times. Every 50 years or so, there would be another expulsion of Jews from someplace. Spain, England, France, etc. Climaxing, of course, in World War II with the murder of 6 million Jews in Europe. This history was so consistent, and always because for 2,000 years in Europe, Jews were always a landless minority, prevented from owning land by laws in many places, and always a minority, and therefore always easy to scapegoat and to persecute and to blame for other people's problems. So in the 1800s, when this new idea of nation state was entering Western civilization in Europe, and particularly in the colonial movement, some Jewish people, particularly in Eastern Europe, founded the Zionist movement. The notion of the Zionist movement was that the way to escape from this consistent persecution of Jewish people was to found a nation state, a Jewish state, so that Jews would finally have their own flag, their own army, something to back them up. They wouldn't be a minority anymore. It actually made perfect sense because the world appeared to be being divided up into these nation states. And so if the Jewish people were to survive, they ought to have one. It didn't look as though there was any place in Europe that they could realistically use for this, and so they actually considered a number of places, including Uganda and Argentina and so forth, but pretty quickly the idea went out of founding a Jewish state in what they called the Holy Land, in what was then called Palestine, in the region of the ancient Israelite kingdoms, Jerusalem, with all of its cultural associations for the Jewish people.